You heard about me, so thanks to JB for inviting me to give this talk. This work's obviously supported by lots of groups, both the NIMH and IBIB, so ReproNIM grants and R01 through the Brain Initiatives program, and INCF has been a supporter from the beginning. So today we'll talk a little bit about the semantic web and what linked data is and why we think it's useful. We'll use a use case example of the neuroimaging data model, which is something we developed, linked data format for neuroscience type information. We'll talk about some of the problems that one encounters when you want to use linked data in your research. These are issues with vocabularies, ontologies, and so forth. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we've gotten past that with our work in neuroscience, and then some of the tools we built to make the use of linked data in neuroscience easier for researchers. And we'll talk about some provenance and workflow models that are new and in development. In fact, all of this is very much in development, but we've made some good progress. And so, at this point, everybody on this call is certainly familiar with the World Wide Web, the idea of linking documents of information together with uniform resource identifiers or locators, these URIs or URLs, depending on what kind of resource you're talking about. And that was, groundbreaking and fantastic, and we all use the World Wide Web every day. And when one goes to start building search engines to search over web documents, you find that a lot of interesting information is embedded in the text on web pages. And Google and other search engines have spent lots of years using natural language processing and so forth to try to extract useful information from the text embedded in web pages and use that in search. And but what we really like to do is annotate some of that text-based information with additional unambiguous URLs or URIs that point to information about what the text is intending the meaning to be, and to use that information to make query tools better, and to connect information on the web to essentially make a web of linked information, as opposed to a web of linked documents that contain useful information.
Dave, can I just quickly say these slides are not in presentation mode and doesn't seem advance. So just want to make sure that you know about that.
I didn't know about that. What about now? No?
Still not changing on my screen anyways.
Okay, so let's unplug the attached additional monitor. And how about now? No?
I can see your mouse moving on the PowerPoint, but
you can't see the PowerPoint. Now you see me. So let's try this again. I'll share the whole screen, and I will then.
Yeah, that works.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Sorry about that. But this is the only slide I showed except for the the beginning slide, so you didn't miss anything. So what we're trying to do is create a web of linked information as opposed to just linked documents, and we're trying to do that with by marking up HTML with URIs. So this is something that happens, kind of behind the scenes that human doesn't see, that the search engines can use to identify what the text in the page is really talking about. And sometimes that's not entirely clear by just parsing through, the paragraphs of text on the page. So the page may be talking maybe really about guitar strings, but in fact, most of the text is talking about guitars. And so the search engine thinks it's about guitars when in fact it's about guitar strings. So with some markup behind the scenes, we can tell the search engines precisely what we mean by the information in the document. And so as introduced by Tim Berners-Lee, there are 4 real design principles of linked data. Those are to use uniform resource identifiers as the names of things, have URIs so that people can look up those names and dereference and understand what you mean. Using these semantic web style standards for describing linked data, that's RDF, and the query language, or one of the query languages, Sparkle, and include links to other URIs from your URIs so that we create more or less a web of linked information. And so that's kind of the overarching goals. Simple linked data primer. The resource description framework is a syntax really for describing resources on the web. And so, when it was originally envisioned, the idea was we could describe any resource that's web accessible. So, databases, computational resources, anything on the web that, would benefit from a precise description of what it is and its meaning. We took this, us and others obviously took this to also imply that that data is a resource and data sets are a resource, and so that we could describe those as well with linked data. And really, the linked data descriptions are tuples. They're made up of a subject, a predicate, and an object. The subject is generally the noun, or it's like the resource. It can be identified with a URI. It could be identified with another unique ID. The predicate is like the verb. It relates the subject and the object, and then the object could be a literal or another URI. So the example below, I guess, makes it very explicit. Here we're trying to say something about Brussels being the capital of Belgium. You can write that in a sentence, Brussels is the capital of Belgium, or you can do it in a linked data style where you have a URI that points you to what Brussels is. You have another URI for the predicate. In this case, it is the capital of, so you'd have a predicate that described what it meant to be a capital. And then the object, which, could be a literal, like, Belgium, just the string. But what would be more useful is having another URI there that described what Belgium is. And so every RDF statement in, every linked data file is a tuple. It's got these 3 parts to it, and we'll see some examples of that. And so by that sense, it's pretty simple to understand. And in these linked data documents, the view of the world it's an open world assumption, which means that, when you build data formats using linked data, it's not a fixed sized header, and, basically, you can continue to add triples or additional statements about the data or the resource to your heart's content, and so that makes it pretty nice for adding additional information when you need to, or using it for describing, in our case, data sets that are changing often, or things that change often, because you can go back and write additional tuples. So once you create these triples, that essentially will create an annotated graph of information, because as we'll see in some upcoming slides, you'll see that you can have annotated edges and annotated nodes in these graphs. And so just a couple kind of examples on the left here. This was just a model that we created to describe rodent data in a UCI Conti Center, where they were collecting, in this case, it was like a DTI, so fusion tensor imaging MRI scans on the rodents. They were doing some kind of processing of the slices of those DTI scans and relating them back to early life stressors of the mother. And on the right, just another example of, so if you're a neuroimager, you've probably used statistical parametric mapping, SPM tool, and FSL. tools. This is, again, kind of a conceptual object model graph of the relationship between information in those result sets that come out of SPM and FSL. And by modeling, in this case, the software this way, we've identified differences between these two software products, SPM and FSL. And so one of the first steps, essentially, of creating a linked to data model for your use, I think, is to sit down and kind of create these object models, which are these sort of graphical representations of how information that you're trying to capture relates to one another. And so in our models, we've built them off with a terminology called the Prov terminology from Luke Moreau's group in Southampton. But essentially, it was a model for describing provenance. And we determined that one could use these core building blocks, an agent, an activity, an entity, and some named edges. That's where you see these was generated by on the graph on the left and was influenced by. So we could use this basic provenance model to describe really any data set. And we'll see some examples of that later. So once you have these, conceptual graphs, you can, if you were to, implement those graphs into a linked to data format, the linked to data formats are they're a graph that's then serialized to a text-based, predominantly text-based file format. And the syntax of those serializations, there's lots of different syntaxes you could use. They're shown on the left: trig, tricks, turtle, N3, all these sorts of things. We prefer, so you could use any of them. There is even a binary one, binary RDF. We prefer to use turtle because we think it's more human readable. Now, these linked data, serializations are really structured and meant for computers. They're not really meant for humans to look at. But, in our space, if you are to write information out into a file, researchers want to see, look in that file, they want to do things with that file. And so we chose turtle because we thought it was the most human readable. And so if we look at the red box at the top, the way you kind of read this and relate it back to what I told you before about a subject, predicate, and object, is you start to read it, and the top line, it says this thing called NIRI, colon, and then some weird unique identifier. That's the subject of this particular set of statements. The A after that is shorthand, and turtle just makes it short, but it's shorthand for RDF colon type. And that's the type of whatever this thing is on the left, that's subject. So the A is the predicate, RDF type, and whatever ends up on the right of that is the object. In this case, we're saying that this thing, NIRI, whatever, EEE, some unique ID, is a NIDM project. And when you see the form of NIDM project, like many of these, it has a colon. So it has this NIDM thing, a colon, and then this word project. That's really a URI. And at the top of these turtle files, it will have a URL that's associated with the NIDM part. And so if you took that URL and you added the project to it, it would dereference, and it should tell you what an NIDM project is. And so you can kind of read through these statements one at a time in the same way. This NIRI thing is a NIDM project. This NIRI thing is a prov activity. This NIRI thing, and then you see DCT or DC types title. So that's another URI, and it, in this case, describes what title means. So we're saying this NIRI thing has a title, and then it has this title. And this particular example came from the OpenNeuro database, one of the data sets. So you can read down through here, and we're saying things about the project. It has a title, it has a license, it has an identifier, it has some authors, a creator, it's a location. And so that's fairly nice for a human to read. We find that people who are used to, like developers who work in our space, generally like working with JSON. And so there's been a development effort in the RDF community to create this JSON LD variant, which is the linked data variant of JSON. Looks just like JSON or well, it looks a lot like JSON. That's the blue box there in the middle. It looks a lot like JSON. It just has some keys. It has some additional levels, hierarchical levels in the JSON file that you may not normally find in a regular JSON file. But then these keys here, like title, license, identifier, there's a context file that's linked at the top of these JSON documents, which makes it JSON LD. And this context document tells you that project in this case has a URL, identifier has a different URL, and so between the context part and the actual rest of the JSON dictionary, you get essentially a linked data version where each of the keys has a URL that links out to describe what it means. And so there's lots of applications of linked data that are out there in existence and being used. Some of which probably are used every day by you and you don't even notice it. Things like markups on web pages using schema.org vocabularies. These are these kind of behind the scenes markups of web pages, and Google will use schema.org tags to search and understand what your web pages are about without you knowing really as a user. So that's pretty interesting. Of course, you have things like a semantic media wiki, which is like a wiki, but has a semantic, this sort of linked data style semantic information embedded in it, DBpedia, that sort of thing. So there are examples out there. There weren't examples of for the use cases that I will describe to you in the next series of slides. So that's why we decided to make our own version of this, our own linked data format for use in neuroscience. But there are a bunch of other variants that are out there and usable. So because there wasn't really a linked data model for what we were attempting to achieve, which was to create a linked data format that could track the life cycle of data in our domain, which is from the data acquisition to the processing and through the statistical modeling steps, and to use that linked set of information to provide more meaning and more detail and context to your manuscripts that usually you read through, the methods section, and you get a certain level of detail, and sometimes that would be insufficient for your use. The idea being that we would like to, at the end of the manuscript, have a link that one could go to that could obviously gain access to the data, but also these rich metadata descriptions of those experimental data, and using then the same kind of core structures and vocabularies to gain access to the derived data or the statistical results of some processing and the processing workflows themselves. So kind of the idea of NIDM, and NIDM has a few different components: the experiment component, the workflows component, and the results component. It's built off of the core set of semantic web technologies. Then we built off of the this Provenance family of specifications, which is a model for describing the provenance of things. And we build upon that with a vocabulary specific to our domain and these object models that are specific to our domain, and then implement a series of tools to make use of those object models or to apply those object models. And so we'll see a little bit of that. And so just to give you an example of the NIDM experiment object model, it's a simple object model. It has, it builds off the prov vocabulary. So we have these blue rectangles, which represent activities that have a start and end time. These blue boxes could be, one activity in your linked data document with a bunch of tuples, statements about information related to this activity embedded in it, or these blue activities could be an entire subgraph of, describing the relationship of things that composed this activity. But right here, I'm just showing it as a blue box. So, but just know these could be whole subgraphs if you wanted to get even more complicated. So we have this common hierarchy in the neuroscience work I've done. You have a project that lives at kind of the root of this hierarchy. There are sessions that are part of the project. There are acquisition activities, the activity of acquiring some data, whatever that data is. And then the acquisition entity, which is generated by that activity of acquiring some data and could include data or metadata about the data. And so it's just this simple multi-part hierarchy that then when used on real data sets could become a fairly complex graph. In this particular picture, it's the same as what we saw in the previous slide, the basic building blocks. You have a project, you have sessions, you have acquisitions. On the left part of the red box, you see the assessment acquisition. So this is like a fictitious study where there were demographic assessments that were collected on a number of participants related to a session. There was also a bunch of image acquisitions that were collected. They're all related and associated with the trapezoids at the top. I guess those are trapezoids at the top that are in pink, that represent the people that are associated with the image acquisitions, and those people can have different roles. In this case, their roles of being a participant in the study, and they have a bit of metadata about them. In this case, it's the NDAR source subject ID. If you were to dereference that, you would go to the NDAR terminology and you would find that it has the subject ID of each of the participants. And then on the right side of this graph, on the blue part, this is an example of NIDM results, same basic building blocks. Activities, entities, these trapezoid things are called agents. An agent can be a person like we saw in the experiment part, or it could be a piece of software. It could be an MRI scanner, that sort of thing. And so on the right side, we've got some derived data. In this case, it was generated by FreeSurfer, a software tool for parcellating the brain. And it's linked into each of the original images that were used to compute the volumes of the different regions of the brain. And we have an activity volume computation here, which would be an example of you would typically want this to be a workflow record. So some subgraph of the workflow that was used to compute the volume. And so in this way, it's really nice if these all are together using the same core building blocks. We can use the RDF tools like Sparkle and some of the ones we've made custom to query for things and to capture in an unambiguous way the information surrounding both the experiment metadata and the result sets of computation. Here's an example of another results set. This is from the statistical parametric mapping SPM example, where again, we've got an object model on the left. It's composed of the same sorts of core building blocks, activities, entities, a series of named edges using the PROV vocabulary. And on the right, you have the turtle serialization of this object model when applied to a particular data set. And so again, it's fairly straightforward to read if you're a human and you want to open it up in a text editor and read. And it's very structured well for computers to be able to find things and compute over. And each of these terms that are used here for the predicates, those should be dereferenceable, so they should come from a proper terminology. And if it's backed by an ontology that relates those terms together to other terms out there, you're quickly creating both a web of linked information, but also providing an avenue at which you can perform some logic, or you can apply some logic on top of this and learn new things. Like you can learn that there are, other data sets that have related information, for example. So one key to this, to making this linked data, work for you in your use case, is having the vocabularies available to be to express the information that you want to express. And so when we started this effort, it started as very much a grassroots effort, a bunch of us getting together and deciding that we think that neuroimaging needs something like this, and we want to query across data sets. But when we went out and started trying to annotate data, we found that the words that we needed just weren't there for our domain. And then the terms or words that were out there in controlled vocabularies really lacked in some of the properties that we need to understand the terms. So some of them just have a description. They may not have units, they may not have ranges, they may not have data types. And so we set out to, as part of one of the more recent R01 project, to precisely define what properties we think are needed for terms, to describe terms so that it's an unambiguous description, so that when you use it, it's meaningful to people. And also to formalize projects that are using terms, like in the case of the right side of this slide, the BIDS community. This is the brain imaging data structure. If you don't know about it, it's another sort of grassroots effort to standardize how we structure files on disk for, it started with neuroimaging and MRI, and it's expanded to other things like EEG, PET. There's a whole bunch of extensions for BIDS. But the idea was that it was a structure for describing things on disk. They were using specific keywords in those structures. Those keywords had definitions, but they weren't formalized in such a way that when you made extensions to BIDS, some of the extensions would reuse terms that were used in another BIDS extension, let's say, and provide different meanings for the same, say, keyword. And so by doing that, you then make things ambiguous. So you could get a BIDS data set that has, maybe an EEG component and an MRI component, and the same words used in both components, but they mean different things. And so for you as a user, that's less than ideal, suboptimal, I guess is a good word for it. So part of this work was to formalize the BIDS terminology along with our NIDM terminologies, provide a nice web page where you can go and you can understand what each of the words are, what it means, and see links. And this is the ontological aspect, see links to other terms and other terminologies that we have reused. We tried not to recreate things that existed with good definitions that were out there and available. But having these things formalized is kind of, having the words available for you to use in your use case is important. Having them be available on the web so that one can dereference them and understand what was meant by the document that's received is important. And then having the correct properties, or having a sufficient number of properties about the terms is also important. So part of this work was to formalize what we thought important properties were for different types of terms. Some of those I've said already, the maximum, minimum values, value type, some people, call that data type, but we went with value type. And then also to provide a property that allows you to relate specific uses of terms that you might find in our domain. So for example, if you were to collect a variable about age in your study, you may collect it as years after birth, or you may store it as days after birth if you're talking about a rodent, or you may store it, or you may be talking about age at the time of a scan or some acquisition. And so, that makes querying across data sets pretty hard. If in one instance, your variable is like age at scan, and in another instance, it's days after birth, but they're all talking about ages. And so this is about property that we have here is an attempt to make querying across data sets better for investigators. And this is about sort of property is where we link out to a higher level concept. So we say for all these examples where you have like, age and days after birth, age at scan, age at psychotic event, all those sorts of things, they're really talking about this broad concept of age. We don't care when we're talking about a broad concept, we don't care what the units are. We don't care really what the frame of reference is. We just care that there are some variables or there's some information in this linked data file that talks about age at the high levels. So we use this is about concept or a property to relate concepts, higher level descriptions of things to data sets to aid in query. And we'll see some examples of that. And so the way we store definitions of terms as we use GitHub, like many people do for version control, basically we have tools for the BIDS community where they can submit new terms to the BIDS community for their evaluation as part of an extension proposal or whatnot. These JSON LD documents, again, look like JSON, but they have the context at the top that tells you what these keys mean. The keys that I showed you in the previous slide with the properties are represented here in these JSON files. It goes into GitHub. The community has a discussion. We the community makes sure that there isn't collisions and so forth with existing terms in the BIDS landscape or ecosystem. And at some point, they get merged in. And at that point, they become formalized and get a URI and then are used in BIDS data sets in the future. We built a little JavaScript tool that allows you to graphically look at these same sort of terminology, the terminologies. So in the case of the BIDS example, you don't have to look at the JSON LD documents. You can look at this JavaScript tool. You can add new terms here. And what this does is it prevents you from adding a term that's already been added to the BIDS ecosystem. And so if you go and try to add a new term that's like another term, it's going to say, hey, this one already exists in BIDS, and it prevents these like collisions. And then you can export terms with their properties. You can choose which properties you want to export. You can get markdown tables or JSON documents or whatnot. And so, we think this process of submitting new terms to a GitHub repository, capturing the social aspect around discussions about that term, and then merging it into the main repo. And at that point, it gets pulled into other resources like information resources that are out there and available for for finding terms like Interlex, which we'll see a little bit in the next few slides. We think it's a good process. How did we, so we have these ideas, we brought them to bear on a problem of searching across all the data sets that are in this database resource called OpenNeuro. And these are all, publicly available data sets. There's probably 356 or so different data sets in OpenNeuro. They're stored in OpenNeuro as this brain imaging data structure data set, but and many of them are unannotated. So they're a data set with the image files, potentially with some assessment information, and oftentimes without any annotations describing what that assessment information is. And BIDS itself doesn't come with a query language, so it's obviously difficult to query across these data sets. And so what we did was, so here's a quick primer on BIDS. Generally, in our MRI scanners, data comes off as these DICOM files, and they get thrown into some directories, and they have all these unique IDs and things that don't mean very much to people. In the past, what each lab would do is essentially write their own parser to parse through the DICOM header metadata and rename things. And so what BIDS really did was just formalize the renaming of things and said, hey, if you rename things this way and we publish this and make it a community standard, then everybody can kind of understand what's in data sets, as opposed to getting a bunch of DICOM files or getting some, custom directory structure that came from a lab. and that you don't understand. But the interesting bit about this BIDS data structure is that there is metadata and information embedded in the file name. So, you see in the top section here, there's this T1W in the file name, and that has meaning. And so what we've done as part of our work is formalize those sorts of concepts and terms that are used here, like T1W. What does that mean to BIDS? What does that mean to the DICOM community? What does that mean to others? And sort of tried to formalize the definitions of things. And then we've created what we call, semantic BIDS or ReproBIDS, where so BIDS has this suggested file, JSON file that lives alongside these TSV files, which are tab separated value files in the BIDS data sets that provide an opportunity for you to store a data dictionary along with this TSV file. So this TSV file is just like a spreadsheet. So it'll have, a header column or a header row where the variable names are the column or for the columns are on the header row. And that's it. And then it'll have data. And so with this JSON sidecar file, of course, you get the data dictionary, or you hope that people will add this JSON file to give a data dictionary to describe what those variables mean. If they were to create a data dictionary, a well-structured data dictionary appropriately, then we have all the information we need to really represent this entire structure as one linked data file. And then you can use the query routines that are provided by the linked data community and really start to query across data sets. So we did this with OpenNeuro. We pulled the data sets from the OpenNeuro database using this thing called DataLad. And if you haven't heard of that, it's kind of like it's Git really for data sets. Git and Git Annex for data sets. So we use DataLad, we pull the data sets, they come out as BIDS. Sometimes they have a JSON file and sometimes they don't. We've built some annotation tools, which will then, and if you ever played the game from Zork, which is like a command, a text-based game, these annotation tools are text-based in that sense. So they will iterate over the header columns in any of the TSV files embedded in these BIDS data sets. They will query information resources like the Interlex, COG Atlas, mental health database, repro schemas, NIDM terminologies, and they will ask you to annotate your variables. So they will ask you about all the properties that I had shown on a few slides ago. They'll ask you about those properties for your variables, and then they'll give you the opportunity to really connect specific variables out to broader concepts. And in some cases, that makes sense depending on what your variables are: age, gender, handedness. Those are things that people will want to know about any data set if they're going to try to combine data together. But they also might want to know about what the data set contains in terms of mental health questionnaires and things like that. So that's where the concept queries really come in. And once you have those concept annotations and full annotations done, it then produces for you that JSON file for your BIDS data set with a full list of those properties that I talked about, with also this addition, and this is about property, which links you out to broader concepts. So we have two command line tools for doing that: a BIDS to NIDM converter, and this takes a CSV to NIDM, can be used with any spreadsheet style data set, comma separated values file. And you can also do this with a JavaScript tool that we're developing. It's almost ready for prime time. So you load in your TSV file from your BIDS data set, and you do it this way. And so once you do that, and once we did that, essentially for about 150 of the studies in OpenNeuro, we can quickly make a query tool that's just based on the concept annotations. And so what you're seeing here are all the concepts that were associated with data sets in OpenNeuro. And so here we're going to do a little query demonstration of searching for data sets that contain some measure of anxiety disorder. At this level, we don't know what that measure is, but we don't care at this level. We just want to find across all the data sets in OpenNeuro, ones that have a measure of an anxiety disorder and have a measure of age. And of course, of course, we're going to be concerned about gender too. So we'll add that to our query, and we find 2 such data sets, which is kind of, I don't know, disheartening, because you might expect to find more, but these are 2 data sets with these measures. And so from that work, we can go through and look at what's the frequency of concept use amongst these OpenNeuro data sets. And kind of interesting to look at, to see that 67% of the data sets that we annotated from the OpenNeuro database contain some measure of impulsivity, and only 53% can contain some measure of gender or sex. So kind of interesting, but once we've annotated these now, we can deposit them. So we can take these NIDM files. So we've annotated our BIDS data sets. By doing that for free, we get these NIDM files, which are these linked data files. ReproNIM has put together this thing called ReproLake, which is like a metadata graph-based search engine. And you can take these NIDM files and you can deposit them there. And we've done so for many, a few publicly available data sets like ABIDE, ADHD 200, the OpenNeuro stuff. And then you can start doing these queries, these concept-driven queries across data sets. Because these NIDM files have links out to the actual data files, you could presumably, build a workflow engine that can take the results of these queries and, depending on access restrictions and so forth, potentially go out and get data files and run some computation on them just from these metadata records. And so once these, once the terms and so forth have been formalized for your use, you can upload them to terminology services like Interlex, and Interlex will then make you a sort of a graphical representation of the relationships similar to what I showed you before that we're doing for NIDM, and kind of mint the URLs for these terms in a more formal information server. So once you have these NIDM files, I told you you could upload them to ReproLake and do some queries. You could also use our command line tools to make use of them for your local data sets. And so here, there's, it would be another lecture to discuss how these queries work. But essentially, we built a tool, PyNIDM. It's a Python library for working with NIDM documents. There's a query tool called PyNIDM Query. It has a REST-based URI query functionality so that you can search these documents for information about the project, information about all the participants, information about the different variables that are, variables that are contained in these documents, and do queries across documents for metadata about a particular subject, things that have been collected about the subject, or metadata about all the subjects, like I picked a couple of fields, age and sex, from this data set, did my REST-based query, and here I have a data file ready to go for analyses. So now when we do analyses, what we want to do is track the provenance of what happened to the data using the same basic building blocks. This is work predominantly by Camille and Mamat in France, and Sadra Ghosh, MIT, and some others that look at using the same sort of entities, activities, agents based on the Prov data model. Same thing we saw for describing experiments, but to describe the workflows, the inputs, the outputs, the process execution, where it was executed, what the parameter choices were. And again, it's going to be in the linked data style, where the parameters for a particular software product would be a URL out to the software products page that tell you what they meant by a certain parameter. And again, these things get serialized in the same fashion, JSON LD, Turtle, or whatnot, same linked data flavor. And so this is a work in progress. There's a BIDS provenance extension proposal, BEP28, it's linked here. It shows you the work we've been doing with NIDM workflows and applying it to BIDS, which is now going to host derived data as well as the structured original data. And so having a provenance records about that derived data is important. We've also then taken another step where we can do simple linear models of information that is contained in these NIDM files. So if you, this is for, again, if you're thinking about querying across data sets and then you want to understand, like, if there's, some high level relationships, are these data sets, good for me to combine together? You can just do some linear models. This is a work in progress, but on the back end of this, the provenance of this linear model would then be written out in this NIDM workflows description and potentially added back into your NIDM document to create this living data document. In linked data, it doesn't matter if everything's in one document or in separate documents, you can link them together. So, the result sets can be in a separate file from the experimental metadata. Okay, so we have a couple more, or one more slide here. Essentially, we have a lot of other NIDM tools to convert serialization formats, to concatenate NIDM documents together, to merge them on subject ID or things like that, to visualize the NIDM document as a graph, and then to working with some tool developers. The idea is that we need to get the tool developers to output their results and workflow information as linked data in order for this sort of life cycle of data idea to really work. And so we have worked on some tools with the free surfer software, SPM, FSL, and some other tools to sort of export NiPipe, a neuroimaging workflows pipeline in Python will output a workflow as an NIDM record as well, even though, it's a workflow record. We're still working on the final model for NIDM workflows, but it's a NIDM style RDF workflow record. And so I've added a bunch of links here to different resources for NIDM, also some webinars and things about data annotation. If you're interested, you can take a look, and these are the places where you'll find information about our progress. And over the years, there's just a lot of people that have worked on this, but I think I've captured many of them here. So thank you very much. I think I'm done.
Thanks a lot, Dave. That was such a nice tour of the a lot of work from the past actually probably 10 years now. Yeah. I know we're kind of short in time, but I'm sure, has anyone any question? Maybe we can get on the chat, or if you feel free to like put your microphone on. And so there's one question on the chat, which is, how does this tool help researchers? Does everything in one place and searchable?
Yeah, so it can help researchers in a couple ways. So it'll help you, certainly helps you query for things in your data sets, and obviously can help you query across data sets. It provides an unambiguous record of your data sets. So I'm sure all of you have received Excel spreadsheets or CSV files, 10 years after a study completes, when you come into a lab that were put together by somebody who's no longer in the lab, and you have no idea what that information is. These are, again, semantically annotated, unambiguous records. So you should, the idea being, you should in 10 years be able to query this document, go to those URLs, and understand what was done, what was collected, and the meaning of the variables and so forth. So that's super useful. If you're working in the bid space, running a BIDS to NIDM conversion and having that NIDM file then allow you to use the query tools that we've built to find, or really any RDF query tool. So you could use Sparkle directly on these documents if you chose to find information. So what I would use it for in that case is I'm building a Python, a bunch of Python scripts to do some data analysis. I'm going to have those Python scripts load up this RDF document, do some queries, find all the particular image types or metadata that I'm interested in using in my analyses, and then just pipe them into my Python-based analysis. You can do some of that with PyBids, Python library for traversing BIDS directories, and you can find certain things, but this is a much richer ability to query.
And also, I guess in terms of reusability, like even and I mean, there's findability, but there's also reusability, like making sure that you know exactly where was meant is, and being able to process that with a computer is key. I have another question from Darcy, which is any linkages with data formats that have their own vocabulary schemas. Some the UK Biobank, we're looking at making of their all their patient subjects into in some tools. How could NIDM tools interact with something like that?
Yeah, so it depends on how they're writing out the data. In terms of like the vocabularies, that's a straightforward process. I think that the linked data community has been using for many years. They have a vocabulary, we have a vocabulary. We're using lots of other vocabularies, and we start to make links between the words. So the word that the UK Biobank is using to describe whatever an anatomical MRI image is related to the word that we use to describe it, and is related to the word that you might find in DICOM that's related to that sort of thing. So connecting the vocabularies and terminologies together, then you can use those ontologies directly in your Sparkle queries, by the way, which is a little more complicated. But once you have an ontology that links information together, now I can write a query that says, okay, query my NIDM document, and then let's query the UK Biobank for the terms in their vocabulary that are related to the terms in my query by a specific relationship. And I would make that specific relationship determination. So I want to find all data sets, I want to find the data sets that are annotated with terms from UK Biobank that are similar to, or the same as, or something else to the terms that I'm using in my NIDM queries. And in that sense, you could map between these two vocabularies. Mapping between the schemas, that's just a transformation. So, graph-based transformations have been done routinely. So,
and I would
but
say,
maybe a little bit harder.
Yeah, and in general, there are many of those schema in tools, and descriptions, formalized descriptions, and I guess one of the issues is how do we write all those translation aspects, or which is probably like a community work rather than the work of one specific group.
Yeah, and then I don't know if they're going to format their data sets as BIDS or not, but that's an entry So JB, myself, we were both at the original BIDS meetings, and I think one of the main points initially of BIDS was like an entry point for researchers. Let's make it easier for researchers to get into structuring their metadata, structuring their data sets so that they're useful for others outside their lab. And yeah, I think that was successful in that sense. And so if UK Biobank is going to format their data sets according to BIDS, then we have a straightforward entry point for the NIDM work. And if not, then we, could think about converting or, again, changing their data set into something that's more BIDS-like, or being able to traverse their data set structures directly and lift this metadata out.
And Darcy, I don't know if you wanted to add a bit on your question, which is basically that some of the descriptors I've done elsewhere may not have like a proper RDF schema, therefore the mapping may not be easy.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a problem. So there are, a few steps to this, and I think a super important step is getting unambiguous metadata in a structured way about your data set. And so I think that's the most important part. Once that's done, we can, build tools to convert one schema into another, to transform one data set into another. It's the missing data that is the major problem. And so, this work here that I presented was just a way of creating structured computer readable data about, in our case, neuroimaging, human neuroimaging. But it's getting that structured information and getting rich amounts of information, data dictionaries and so forth about data sets is the first step. And so if you're doing that, I think we can work out the rest. When you go to deposit metadata about your data set into a resource, if you're going to make your data set public, there are a small number of resources out there for you to do that. And we're working with many of those in how we structure the metadata.
And I think, just to reemphasize, I hope I hope I conveyed properly your question, Darcy. But if not, please don't hesitate to tell me. I think the general thing is it's a very much like a community-based effort, which if that is going to work on a larger scale, which is so there's a bit of there's a lot of the technical aspect, and there's a lot of the communication and community aspect that has to be built at the same time, I guess.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention there's a thing called shackle schema. So you can validate RDF documents in a couple different ways. One of them is this shackle method, and shackle allows you to create the schema essentially for your model, and those schema documents can be viewed just like XML schema if you had experience with those. And those schema documents then are the avenue at which we would go about mapping one schema into another schema.
Which is the thing that Nexus is using, for instance, in the Blue Brain project and in at CAMH, for instance. Yeah.
And I'll be honest, when I was first, when linked data was first, suggested to me, I was in XML. I was using XML, and I'm like, why would I want to go use this linked data thing? Like it's harder for humans. It's hard for humans to read. I mean, XML was pretty hard too, so I didn't really like that much. And XPath queries are kind of weird. But this was just, seemed to be another version of that. But then when you sit down and you start to use these basic building blocks and you start to model information in your labs, like we built whole graphical user interface, database resources, just using linked data model, these object models and anything I've tried to model with this, I can model. And it's unambiguous in the sense that I'm picking terms and I'm providing additional meaning. And that's when I started to really like it. I was like, this is cool. You can make these models of your data. You can store them as graphs. You can export spreadsheets to your heart's content anytime you want of these data. So if you want to make just like a regular spreadsheet that you would, typically hand to a postdoc and let them go off and do data analysis, you can, but it's coming from this linked data document, which is unambiguous and semantically meaningful, and that will be useful for you in 10 years when you can't remember what was in that data file.
We are running a bit out of time. I'm sure. I think that the time is, let's say, officially finished. If there is, or if there are a couple of more questions, Dave, if you have a few minutes, maybe we can stay on the call a few minutes. But otherwise, if not, I'm just making sure that the chat is not active. If not, I would like to very much thank you, Dave. That was a superb tour of a lot of the interesting technology that have been used for annotating and searching and making data and pipelines fairer, findable, accessible. I mean, reusable is, I think, the thing that we really are working on hard now.
Yep.
Thanks very much again. And there will be more on this, I'm sure. This is like a very active development, and so things are moving fast on this side of the world.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for inviting me, and stay warm out there in Canada. Hopefully, I get there soon.
Excellent.
Okay.
Bye, Dave.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.